Hello there. Today we have something different from the usual content I've done. I wanted to try give you a more narrative experience to a playthrough that I hope you'll enjoy watching. Before we dive into the story, let's go through the setting. The setting takes place 10 years after the apocalypse all started. To provide a more realistic and immersive experience, the sandbox settings have been tweaked a little bit to resemble what life would be like at this time. The zombie population has been set to low with respawns turned off. Water and electricity have been shut off, and non-perishable food is essentially non-existent. Loot is hard to come by to simulate things being scavenged over the years. Within reason, of course. So, without further ado, let's get into the story. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. This is the tale of Tony Greystone, a hardened survivor who has spent the last 10 years with a nomadic survivor commune traveling the landscape outside of Knox County. It has been 10 difficult years since the start, and this new life is a cruel mistress. He was no stranger to the harsh, unforgiving world brought upon by the outbreak. Tony lived one day at a time, and often questioned if all of this was worth it. Was there truly a point to all of this? One day, a lone survivor passed by their commune, asking for shelter from the outside world. As they ate by the fire under the moonlit sky, he told of a fabled survivor stronghold located somewhere within Knox County. The traveler didn't know if this was true or even where it was, but said it had been there since the beginning, according to reports that he'd heard. The thought of this, even if it were a myth, kept Tony up at night. He couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope that not all was lost. He was separated from his family when the chaos started years ago, and the military had carried off his wife and son somewhere else, somewhere safe. He couldn't help feeling that there may be a possibility that his family somehow survived the apocalypse, no matter how small. After years on the road and a determined look in his eye, he bid farewell to his friends at the commune and trekked many miles back to his hometown of West Point to see what had become of his old home, and attempt to track down the survivor stronghold in hopes of finding his family alive. Upon returning and seeing nothing but the eerie silence of an overgrown shell of a town, the streets once were alive with holidaymakers and laughter. Now, silence. Save for the scatterings of undead whom he once called neighbors. Tony knew that he would not find the camp here. West Point was not anywhere near secure enough for that. He knew he had to travel to the other towns in the county and hopefully pick up a trail, anything that would lead him closer. This is Tony's story. After arriving in West Point, Tony knew that he had to find a vehicle. On his way in, it was clear that this was going to be a challenge, considering the condition of the cars littering the street. Taking shelter in an abandoned house, he began his quest by looting whatever he could find. He would need the supplies for the journey ahead. Before heading out, he was lucky enough to find a pristine crowbar, along with some building tools. He wasn't planning on staying here for long, mind you. Leaving the house, he was greeted by the first sight of his old neighbors. Luckily, the horde seemed to have thinned over the years, and the zombies here were ragged from wear and tear. He knew he needed to find a temporary location to settle down in while he prepared for his journey, moving from house to house to search for food supplies and whatever he could find. Fortunately for him, some of the homes still contained some valuable skill books that he would need for the road ahead. These past 10 years, he had been so focused on surviving with the commune that he never felt the need to learn these skills. Litterings of undead stood in his path, the overgrown streets hiding them in plain sight. He dispatched them as quickly as he could, so not as to draw unnecessary attention. Moving carefully was the only option. One wrong move, and his journey will come to an end. was getting late. He needed to find somewhere safe to stay for the night. At last, he found it. A small, but relatively safe house. Scanning through to check for supplies and any potential threats, he tried to settle in for the night. However, the overgrown bed was having none of it, and it wasn't that comfortable anyway. He decided to circle back to the previous house and snack on some peanut butter he found. While trying to get a head start on a book about carpentry, he was never a very fast reader, only managing to get through a couple of pages at the most. Maybe it was his weary eyes that made the reading difficult. And so, he decided to turn in for the night. Tomorrow he will search for a better place to rest. He awoke to the sound of falling rain. How he missed the weather of Knox County. But no time to wait indoors. He needed to move quickly. Heading outside, he was immediately greeted by some undead that had wandered in from the night before. No matter, the years had made them slow and easy to deal with. They were undead, but their bodies could still rot after all. Clearing out the last remaining undead, he turned to leave. A mistake. Suddenly, a biter appeared out of nowhere and bit deep into his left arm. In a panic, he killed the walker, fearing this would be the end. But Lady Luck smiled on him that day, as it was only a slight wound and no bite marks were present. Breathing a sigh of relief, he bandaged up his wounds with some rags to stop the bleeding. It looks like it will heal soon enough. Time to press onward. He continued looking for a suitable place to settle down while he was in West Point, moving through the undead that littered the street and scavenging whatever supplies he could find in the houses along the way. He could feel the pain from his wound. He may not have been bitten, but he needed some rest and some food, which was scarce. Very scarce. He decided to take shelter in one of the nearby houses for the night. Today he had not found a place, but had made some good progress. Laying down on the bed, he remembered he had a bass guitar that he found when he first arrived. He's no expert at playing, but he learned a thing or two in his years on the road. Music, and those that can play it, is a rare thing to hear these days. As he laid there, playing a song that he learned 2 years ago, he thought of his next move after West Point. He had no idea where he needed to go, or where to even start. No matter, the time will come when he will know. For now, he must rest and continue on in the morning. Tony awoke in the early hours of the morning to the sound of the pouring rain, still clutching the bass guitar. Perhaps it brought him some comfort while he slept. He consulted his map and decided that he must continue downtown in search of a place to stay. After feasting on a hearty breakfast of cereal, he trudged through the pouring rain. He knew that he needed to get out as soon as possible, as the rain made it difficult to navigate and the wound in his arm still throbbed. At last, he came upon it, an abandoned store that he immediately knew would be his safe little haven while he prepared for his journey ahead. After scavenging what little was left in the store downstairs, he found a map to Louisville, or rather, a piece of one. It was at this moment that he knew he needed to go there. If there was ever a survivor stronghold, it would be in the city. Before he could settle in here, he needed to make sure that the perimeter was secure. Heading through the back door, he caught sight of possibly the best car he had seen in years. Dispatching a few stragglers surrounding the vehicle, he attempted to open the door. But here was a problem. The car, while in perfect condition, had no keys. In all his years on the road, he never even bothered to dive into the knowledge of cars and knew nothing of even hot wiring them. He cursed himself for never trying to learn. No matter, he had found a home and the car wasn't going anywhere. It was right outside after all. He could come back to it later on. Before he could head back inside or even search for a key, he looked over to see a horde incoming. They must have been attracted by the sound of him murdering the others. With the pain from his wounds still throbbing with vicious intensity, he managed to kill them. It was time to settle in and make sure the building was secure. Much to his luck, there was not a zombie in sight, only the cold but slightly comforting house upstairs. It was still early in the day, so he had some time to head further down the street and see if he could grab some supplies. Above all, food was his main priority. It was hard to come by, and he was going through his meager supply at a rather rapid pace. One building in particular caught his eye. The bank. Surely there must be a kitchen inside with something. Anything. Making his way upstairs, he searched for signs of the kitchen. Rounding the corridor, he heard them. The garbled cries of the undead. All in the very room that he was searching for. Tony had two choices. Stay and fight, or retreat to come back another time. He was getting tired and hungry, so the choice was obvious. He knew to pick his battles carefully and ran, praying that he would not be followed. Retreating back to the safety of the store, he sat down to chow on some tasty peanut butter to stave off the hunger for a bit. Thoughts of his journey being a lost cause consumed his mind, so much so that he calmed it in the only way he could at the time. Pulling out a guitar, not caring if it attracted the undead, he began to play. It worked too. Finally, he could drift off into an uneasy sleep. Tony started the day with a hearty breakfast of canned bolognese before engaging in a very important task. If he was to stay here, why not clean the place up a little? As much as he was used to roughing it out in the wild, he didn't want to have to sleep on overgrown plants if he didn't have to. Besides, who knows how long he will be here, so he may as well make the most of it. With the living area clean and sweat dripping off his forehead, Tony still had some daylight to burn. Today he thought about heading over to the mechanic shop, which he spied not too far away. He had some distance to close though, so looting whatever he could while he moved there seemed like a good plan. As Tony made his way over to the workshop, he couldn't help but notice an attractive looking bike. If he could find a key or get it working, it would help with moving quicker around town. No luck. There was no key nearby. However, a zombie with a motorcycle helmet wandered over. Maybe this was his ticket to getting the key. He swiftly dispatched it and realized that it in fact did not possess a key. No matter, he thought, it was time to press on. He had reached the workshop. Time to gather some supplies to maintain his future ride. Jacks, tire pumps, wrenches, whatever was available. He was also lucky enough to find a manual that would teach him how to maintain motorcycles. Unsure if this would come in handy, he took it just in case, as it seemed like a quick read. Satisfied that he had taken what he thought was necessary, he returned to his safe house. All this mechanical equipment was heavy, and carrying it on his back was exhausting. After depositing the supplies, albeit rather unceremoniously, in containers around his safe house, he ended the night with a good dinner, which was much needed after all his hard work today. If there was one thing he learned in his years on the road, it was that you can never be too vigilant. In the fading light, he quickly scanned the street to ensure the coast was clear, and he turned in for the night. Perhaps this night would be more peaceful as things were starting to come together. When Tony awoke, he was greeted by a thick, ominous fog that had rolled in overnight. It would be dangerous to head out today, and so he settled in to read a book on carpentry until the fog cleared enough for him to leave. As he's always been a slow reader, he completed the book in the late afternoon. With the fog finally cleared, he ventured back out into the street to look for some medical supplies in the dentist shop that he spotted earlier. It was getting late. Hopefully, he would be fortunate enough to find some medicine. He was in luck here. The medicine supplies seemed untouched, and he took more than he needed for the journey ahead. One can never be too careful. As the sun began to set, Tony made his way back home. As soon as he reached the crossroads, he heard it, the haunting moans of his old neighbors. Scanning around in panic to see where they were coming from, he realized they must be coming from the building across the street. This was not good. Having them so close to him meant they could wander in at any time. He had to make sure it was clear. It was not. In fact, there were many. Despite his tiredness, he had to fight. He had to stay alive. As the last zombie fell, he breathed a sigh of relief. He was safe for the time being. However, there was one more surprise waiting for him within the walls of his temporary home. With all the commotion outside, a lone zombie had fallen through the windows behind the counters. If he hadn't spotted it in time, he could have risked being bitten while his back was turned. He had to find some materials to fortify this place a bit. But that was an issue for tomorrow, he thought, as he inhaled a cigarette by the moonlit window. As Tony opened a can of peas, he realized how low his food supplies were running. He was going through them much faster than he anticipated, but today he needed to gather some materials to barricade the openings in the shop downstairs. Heading out in the gentle rain, he knew just the place for this: Mendy's Eatery. With all the chairs and tables in there, he hoped to gather enough planks and nails to at least fortify some of the windows. He wasn't very proficient with taking apart furniture though. Hopefully he wouldn't destroy half of them by accident. Salvaging what he could, he was rudely interrupted by a few stragglers drawn to the sound of his antics. The windows would keep him safe for a little while, but not long. He needed to get rid of them before they attracted more. With the walkers dead, he scanned the street in one quick sweep to make sure there were no more. Satisfied that the coast was clear, he returned to the eatery to finish dismantling the rest of the furniture. He failed many times, destroying half of the chairs in the process, but he did learn a thing or two for the future. All he managed was 6 planks and a handful of nails. Not nearly enough, but still something. The planks were heavy, even for someone with his strength. It was a challenge to lug them back. Packing what he could handle, he slowly made his way back home. His actions in the eatery had set him back the entire day. It was late, and he didn't have the energy to begin barricading the windows. Storing his spoils in the nearby crates, he settled in for some dinner before getting ready to sleep. He had definitely pulled a muscle carrying those heavy planks around. Hopefully, a good night's rest would help him recover enough for the morning. As the rain gently fell on the window pane, he drifted off to sleep. He awoke at 8 AM in the morning, a little later than his usual rising time. Tony decided that he needed to explore the shopping lane further for some critical supplies. Above all, he needed to get a vehicle working so he could get out of town. If he couldn't somehow get the pristine car outside of his safe house working, he needed to search for another. Heading further down the street, Tony came upon the local police station. It was overgrown, absolutely covered in plants. It may be worth checking inside, he thought. Perhaps there were some guns that he could use. Carefully moving inside, he scanned the rooms for potential zombies. In the distance, he could hear a zombie banging on a door. Hearing the worst, he hurriedly collected what he could. There were no firearms here. They must have all been looted way before he got here. But he did find some useful blunt weapons. Now it was time to get out of there. Tony moved over the street to further explore. How fortunate! A car park with a number of parked cars. Seeing these reminded him of his goal. There were a few stragglers in the park, but it was nothing that he couldn't handle. Sadly though, none of the cars were worth his time, at least for now. It turned out that the car park belonged to a diner, which he almost walked past without investigating. The kitchen was barren, save for a few cooking utensils. But what was he expecting this far into the apocalypse? It had been 10 years after all. He had to find more food if he was going to make his journey. Grimly, he continued down the street, clearing all that was in his way. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted it. The local hardware store. Perfect, he thought. This should give me just what I need. He scurried in and looted what he could find. Nails, screws, duct tape, and even another perfect condition crowbar. He was lucky this day. To his surprise, he found components to create solar panels. He would have to come back for them later, as he wasn't planning on staying here and they were heavy. Very heavy. Just next door, a quaint grocery shop with exactly what he was looking for: food, albeit very small amounts, but it would have to do. Tony realized that it was starting to get late and so headed back to the safety of his shelter. Making it back without any complications, he treated himself to a snack and stored his latest findings. He never cared much for organizing things, but knew once he found a more permanent place to call home, he would have to learn how to do it better. As he had his nightly cigarette by the window, Tony could feel things finally starting to come together. With a few more days and a working car, he could soon get on the road and begin his search. Breakfast this morning was a delicious can of chili, a spicy start to a good day ahead. Tony decided to get a head start on some of the magazines that he had acquired. The knowledge to set up those solar panels and how to create herbal remedies would come in handy later on. Now it was time to barricade those broken windows downstairs. He cleared some items out of his inventory, gathered up the planks and the nails that he found, and got to work. He only had 6 planks and realized that one of the windows was still left wide open. So far, in his time here, he only had one intruder creep through it, so hopefully it should be okay for now. He knew it was time to head to the bookstore down the street, the one next to the dentist. He couldn't take many books, but took what he thought he would need for the road ahead. Knowledge doesn't come easy these days, and he could use a few tips and tricks that the books would give him. With a few key books in his possession, he headed back to get started on reading them. One stood out to him, a book on electrical knowledge. This one would take a while and contained a lot of hard theory, but he powered through it as best as he could, only managing to get through it halfway before his stomach growled with hunger. After a quick snack, he settled back in to finish the book. Finally, late in the evening, he finished it. His weary eyes made it difficult to read the words on the page. Satisfied with his newfound, albeit basic knowledge, he slowly made his way to bed. As soon as his head hit the pillow, sleep took over. Today, after snacking on a breakfast of delicious canned potato and a quick cigarette, Tony knew he needed to venture further into the residential part of West Point. The reason for this was one of two things: a car he could find keys for, and perhaps more food supplies. As he trudged on, the rain grew harder and the sky began to darken. It looked like a storm was rolling in, so he had to move fast. Finding an open window and hopping through, he began to search the first house he found. To his surprise, he found a water bottle. Perfect, he thought. Now I won't have to lug around this heavy cooking pot. For now, he placed the pot in his bag and continued on. Upstairs, he found a little treat. A violin. There wasn't much to do these days in terms of hobbies, so why not take it, he thought. He had the time to learn, and it was better than doing the same thing every day. He left the house and continued on down, the rain growing increasingly stronger with an eerie fog settling in. What Tony didn't know was that this would be the one house that he was looking for all this time. The one house that would give him what he needed. Hopping over the fence, he made his way inside. After checking the kitchen for some leftover food supplies, it was in the bookcase that he found it. A key, and not just any key, a key to a nearby car. A key to his potential salvation. Now his only hope was that the car is in serviceable condition. But that was not his only strike to this lucky find. In a nearby dresser, there was also a big red hiking backpack. The duffel had served him well, but he knew he could carry much more with this. His surroundings seemed safe enough, so he quickly transferred what items he had between the two bags. He decided to keep the duffel for later so he could store more inside the car. He had been so busy looking for supplies that he didn't even notice his own stomach growling from hunger. He flopped down on the couch and pulled out a box of cereal. It didn't taste the same without milk, but it satisfied his gnawing hunger for the time being. He had lost a lot of weight while he was on the road. Food was always hard to come by, and the commune rarely ever stopped long enough to start farming some crops. His rest was short-lived, however, As soon as he stepped outside, 3 shamblers immediately rushed over to him. The rain made it difficult to sense them. With calm determination, he dispatched them. He couldn't believe his eyes. Sitting in the driveway was a black Dash Rancher. The car matched the key that he found. He hurried over and inspected its condition, praying that it was in working order. Of course, things rarely ever went his way. True, he had the key, but both the battery and the fuel tank had run dry. If he wanted to get this thing going, he needed to find a battery. Hold on, he thought, I know just where to find one. With still some more daylight to burn, Tony marked its location on his map. He could still loot a few more houses before he had to head back. And so, he got to work. He furiously checked every vehicle he came across to see if it had a working battery. No such luck. Still, he had made progress. Very big progress. As the light started to fade, he made his way back home. With his supplies stored, he tried to make some progress on a book about mechanics. If he was to get on the road soon, he would need to buff up his knowledge on how to maintain the car. With a snap, he closed the book. He was just too exhausted to continue. He headed to the bedroom and faded into blissful sleep. Today was a big day. At least that's what Tony thought it would be, or rather, he hoped. He needed to get that rancher working as soon as he could. He remembered that there was a working battery in the vehicle that was parked outside of his safe house that should fit in it. Gathering up the gas cans he stocked, he siphoned off as much gas as he could from it, ripped out the battery, and slowly made his way back to the marker he placed on his map. The battery was a perfect fit, and the gas he siphoned off would keep him going for a little while. Getting into the vehicle, he slotted in the key and turned it. The engine roared to life. He could tell she was a nippy one, and he wasn't complaining. The faster the car is, the faster his search would be. He would just need to be careful not to crash it. Arriving back home, he knew from experience that the undead would follow. They were drawn to noise above anything else. Sure enough, on the horizon, a group approached, following the noise of the engine. Gritting his teeth, he got to work. He prayed that they would be the only ones who would follow. After waiting with bated breath, no more came. He breathed a sigh of relief as he wearily trudged up the stairs. After tending to his needs, he settled in to read for a bit. With all the stress of late, it was tough to get through all the books he had uncovered. He could feel that his time in this shell of a town was almost at an end, but for now, it was time to sleep. The thought of the journey ahead made his sleep restless. He tossed and turned no matter what he tried. Furious, he got out of bed in the early hours of the morning. After an early morning smoke and his last can of carrots, he got to work loading up the car. Before he could leave, he needed more food. Otherwise, he wouldn't last a day out there. So, as the sun began to rise, he moved further into the suburbs to find what little he could. Stumbling through the trees, he came across a house with boarded up windows. It was the first of its kind that he had seen. If the windows were boarded up, that means survivors must have been here. With a tug of his crowbar, he forced off the planks off of the windows. Making his way inside, he found not food, but a massive cache of weapons. What happened to these poor souls, he thought? They had so much firepower, yet even they couldn't survive the plague. As tempted as he was to take these with him, he knew he couldn't. In all his years, he had grown accustomed to using close combat with the undead. Taking these would do him more harm than good, at least for now. Besides, he barely even knew how to use one. He made a mark on his map so he could return here later on, when the time comes. The houses further in yielded very little in the way of food. He was growing anxious. Time was of the essence here. He needed food, and soon. His anxiety over finding food would soon be replaced. After trying to get into a house, he caught sight of a horde inside it. He was already tired from the lack of sleep the night before, and this was the worst situation for him to be in. In a panic, he began to fight for his life. In a rage, he finished off the last of his old neighbors. He was lucky. He almost came close to being bitten here. He reminded himself to be more careful in the future. After that ordeal, he knew it was time to head back. He could not risk another engagement like that, not in his exhausted state. He flopped down on the chair to catch his breath, his eyes growing even more heavy. He was so tired that even opening a can of food was a huge task. He desperately needed rest. As his body hit the mattress, the sweet embrace of sleep washed over him. Today was the day that he would finally get onto the road to begin his search. He awoke early in the morning, deciding to quickly finish reading all the magazines that he had gathered. He wouldn't need them after all, and they can be left behind here. With growing anticipation, he stored what little he had in his duffel bag and packed his things in the car, making sure to siphon what fuel he could for the trip. 2 cans should do the trick. He knew he would eventually be back, so only took what he thought he needed most. Glancing back at the safe house that he had created, he couldn't help feeling that he would miss it a little. He had spent the last 2 weeks within the safety of its walls. As the car roared to life, it was time to finally begin his journey into the now untamed countryside of Knox County. He knew not where the road would take him. He finally felt alive and full of purpose. The hope of possibly finding his family was the only thing that kept him going.